The pre-flood era, described in Genesis, appears as a time before the Great Flood, marked by progress and a spirituality that was becoming corrupted. Humanity was organizing itself, building, learning, and leaving signs of power, but at the same time drifting away from the Creator. In this setting, we see Adam and Eve forming the first family outside of Eden, and among their children, Cain, who becomes the first to shed blood by killing his brother Abel. Because of that, he receives a mark from God and goes to the land of Nod, where he starts a new city and a lineage that would continue the story. In this video, we'll explore this little-known period, showing what the accounts suggest about daily life, achievements, and the choices that paved the way for the judgment of the waters. We'll compare interpretations, understand the symbolism, and reflect on what this time reveals about the human condition. This context shows that the flood wasn't an isolated act, but a response to a cycle of rebellion. Stay with us, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel to follow our next videos. The Bible records that the first city was called Enoch, in honor of Cain's son, showing already in Genesis 4 that humanity appeared organized and active. The biblical account presents the human being as a direct creation of God, endowed with reason, moral sense, and the ability to create, not as the result of a slow and impersonal process. From the very first centuries, people demonstrated technical skill and creativity. Cain, the first man born on earth, built a city. His descendants expanded knowledge, developing a nomadic life with herds, ensuring sustenance and safety. Others stood out in the arts, inventing musical instruments. And there were also those who advanced in metallurgy, working with copper and iron. All of this shows that before the flood, there was culture, social organization, and material resources. By the time we reach Noah's generation, there was already a solid foundation for such an enormous project as the Ark, built according to the plan given by God. Even though the biblical text doesn't describe every stage of that period, it makes it clear that the ancient world wasn't primitive, but the result of a humanity created with full ability to think, plan, and transform its surroundings. This perspective contrasts with theories that see humans as slowly evolving until reaching reason. In the Bible, intelligence is present from the very beginning, explaining why cities, trades, and art appeared so early. Thus, the account points to a beginning already full of potential. The length of the period before the biblical flood still raises doubts and discussions. The accounts don't specify exactly how much time passed before the Great Flood, but the overall text suggests it might have been a very long interval, maybe even longer than the time described afterward. Anyone trying to date this period runs into the lack of objective data. The most commonly used basis is the genealogy in Genesis 5. But it wasn't written to serve as a calendar. Its main purpose is to show the continuity of the people and highlight figures that tradition considered important. So, when the text says someone fathered a certain person, it may simply mean that a line of descendants came from them, not that it was their immediate child. This way of recording families with possible skips between generations appears in other parts of the Bible and shows that the theological intent was more important than an exact count of years. That's why any calculation trying to turn these lists into a precise timeline needs to be viewed with caution. It's working with information the text itself never meant to provide. The pre-flood genealogy presented in Genesis 5 is seen by many scholars as an important clue to understanding human development before the flood. Even though it doesn't allow for exact dating, the account points to a context in which people lived for centuries, like Adam, who lived 930 years, Seth 912, and Noah 950. Lives that long would have made it easier to pass down knowledge continuously, observe the world over long periods, and refine techniques, which helps explain progress in practical and creative fields, from farming to building. Another important element is the biblical reference to humanity speaking a single language, a condition that would make the sharing of ideas more direct and efficient, forming a society able to combine efforts, deepen discoveries, and expand its cultural expression. Beyond these factors, the continuity of generations, listed name by name, suggests a preserved collective memory, where each family received the legacy of those before them and carried it forward, creating a fertile environment for intellectual and spiritual growth. In this way, the biblical narrative gains depth. The long lifespan attributed to the men who lived before the flood is usually understood, in a literal reading of the biblical account, as one of the reasons for the advancement of knowledge at that time. Living for centuries would have allowed them to accumulate experience, improve tools, and pass down teachings to many successive generations. However, the same period in which knowledge flourished was also marked by a growing distance from God. The narrative shows that the lifestyle started by Cain, rebellious and violent, spread throughout society until corruption became the rule rather than the exception. This decay wasn't just external. It came from hearts that no longer recognized the Creator's authority. An illustrative case is that of Lamech, mentioned in Genesis 4:18-24. He takes more than one wife, introducing polygamy, kills 2 men, and instead of showing remorse, he boasts about what he's done, as if divine justice itself were something to be challenged. The picture that emerges is of a humanity capable of producing and creating, yet determined to use its abilities under the guidance of sin. Because of this, the judgment of the flood appears as God's response to evil that had already become systemic. In this context, longevity, which could have been a blessing to deepen the knowledge of God, ended up serving to extend and expand the influence of evil, preparing the ground for the judgment that came upon the whole earth. In the book of Genesis, there's a passage that sparks special curiosity. The account in chapter 6, where it talks about the so-called sons of God who came near the daughters of men. This short but mysterious episode has opened the door to many interpretations throughout history. One of them is the idea that rebellious spiritual beings crossed their boundaries and joined with human women, giving rise to an unusual generation known as the Nephilim. The term comes from the Hebrew Nephilim and is usually associated with fallen ones or giants, although the biblical text doesn't clearly describe who they were or how they lived. Even so, tradition presents them as powerful figures, possibly influential and feared in their time. More than just feeding curiosity about extraordinary beings, the chapter highlights the moral landscape of that period. Wickedness was growing, violence was spreading, and humanity was drifting away from God's purpose. In this context, the appearance of the Nephilim seems almost like a visible sign of a creation that had lost its way, until the judgment of the flood is announced as God's response to the corruption that had overtaken the earth. By keeping this passage brief, the biblical author invites the reader to focus less on the spectacle and more on the cause of the disaster that was about to come. For many interpreters, the reference to the Nephilim in Genesis isn't meant just to talk about extraordinary figures, but to illustrate the process of spiritual decay that took over humanity when groups committed to God began mixing with people who had rejected His principles. The descendants of Seth are usually seen as the branch that preserved divine knowledge. But by joining with the lineage marked by Cain's rebellion, they open the door for wickedness to spread without restraint. Out of that environment came the Nephilim, described as men of great influence and reputation in ancient times. Not necessarily giants, but figures of strength and prominence. Some scholars even suggest that the impressive physical traits of later characters, like Goliath, might echo that ancient heritage, even though the biblical text doesn't make that direct connection. Despite this scene of pre-flood corruption, The biblical narrative makes a point of reminding us that not everyone gave in. Abel appears as the first to give his life for his faithfulness. Enoch is presented as someone who walked so closely with God that he was taken without experiencing death. And Noah stands out as the example of righteousness that God found when violence and injustice had already become the norm. These names serve as a counterpoint to the overall decay. They show that even when most people turn away, God preserves a living testimony in history and works through it. In this way, the story of the pre-flood period isn't just a memory of judgment, but also of grace at work in the midst of chaos. The biblical narrative presents the time before the flood as an age of deep corruption, when almost all of humanity had abandoned the ways of the Lord. In that setting, Noah stands out as a distinct figure. He remained upright and obedient while most people gave themselves over to violence and injustice. Because of that, God chose him to preserve life in the face of the coming judgment. The flood, therefore, wasn't a sudden act, but God's response to the limits of human wickedness, marking the end of that era. The Bible also reminds us that before Noah, other servants had shown faithfulness, like Abel and Enoch, showing that God always kept a remnant, even in hostile times. Later, Peter, when mentioning this event, emphasized that the destruction of the ancient world serves as a warning. When wickedness becomes the rule rather than the exception, God's judgment becomes inevitable. Thus, the story of the flood remains a testimony that grace reaches those who turn to the Creator, but continual injustice sooner or later leads to judgment. It shows that God sees the human condition, honors those who stay faithful, and steps into history to restore what has been corrupted. In the New Testament, Jesus warns that near the end, humanity will repeat the behavior of the generation that lived before the flood. Men and women will be busy with their daily routines, planning parties, making deals, celebrating achievements, and chasing pleasure, but without paying attention to the call to change their lives. Just like back then, God's warning will be seen as something distant, and many will only realize the seriousness of the moment when judgment is already underway. Jesus emphasizes that the final days will bring surprise to those who remain indifferent. Those who reject repentance and keep living in evil risk being separated when God intervenes decisively in history. This parallel isn't meant to scare, but to awaken. There's still time to align your heart with the Lord's purposes, to live with faith and obedience, and not be counted among those who ignore heaven's warnings. Each person is called to look within, recognize their sin, and turn to God while He still speaks. Because when the moment comes, there won't be room for spiritual improvisation. The account of the time before the flood shows that simply existing isn't enough. It's necessary to choose to walk with God consciously. It reveals that righteousness isn't a religious ornament, but a posture that preserves us amid moral confusion and the judgments that come when everything seems lost. This message is still relevant today because we live in times of hurry, distraction, and relativism, and it's easy to forget who should guide our decisions. Those who nurture a living relationship with the Lord find direction for today, courage for tomorrow, and discernment not to be swept away by the crowd. If you want to grow in your understanding of the Bible and strengthen your faith, subscribe to our YouTube channel and join us.